My name is Clara Mendez. And for 32 years, I was the invisible one. Not invisible in the way people sometimes mean it, like being shy or quiet or easy to overlook at a party. I mean truly, deliberately invisible. The kind of invisible that only happens when people who are supposed to love you decide, one day, that you are simply not worth the effort. Before I tell you the rest of this story, if you're new here, welcome. I'm glad you found this. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. And if this sounds like someone you know, or someone you've been, drop a comment below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. My mother had 3 children. My older brother Daniel, who was charming and loud and could fill a room with his laughter. My younger sister Isabel, who was beautiful and sweet and could make my mother cry happy tears just by walking into a room. And then there was me, Clara, who was none of those things. At least, that was what I was told. I remember the exact moment I understood my place in that family. I was 9 years old. It was my birthday. My mother had baked a cake, a beautiful yellow cake with white frosting and pink roses along the edges. I remember thinking for one breathless second that it was for me. It wasn't. It was for Daniel. His football team had won a regional championship that same week, and my mother had decided that was worth celebrating. My birthday was mentioned once, at the end of dinner, when my Aunt Rosa quietly said, "Isn't today also Clara's birthday?" My mother looked up from cutting Daniel's cake and said, "Oh, yes. Happy birthday, Mija," and then went right back to serving my brother. I blew out a candle on my own that night. A birthday candle I found in a kitchen drawer. I put it in a piece of leftover bread and made a wish in the dark of my room. I wished to be seen. That wish took a very long time to come true. As the years went on, I learned that in my family, worth was measured in performance. Daniel's worth was measured in touchdowns and trophies. Isabel's worth was measured in beauty and obedience. Mine was measured in nothing because, according to my mother, I produced nothing worth measuring. I was average in school, plain in appearance, and the worst sin of all, I was strange. I liked books about history and science. I liked fixing broken electronics in the garage. I liked math, which my mother called cold and unfeminine. Clara doesn't have a gift, I once heard her tell a neighbor, her voice low but not low enough. She's a good girl, but she has no spark. I was 14 years old. I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, and I pressed my back against the wall, and I breathed very slowly, and I decided 2 things. The first was that I would never cry over my family again. The second was that I would prove her wrong, even if she never lived to see it. When I was 18, I left. There was no dramatic fight, no tearful goodbye. I simply packed a bag, accepted a scholarship to a state university 400 miles away, and walked out the front door on a Tuesday morning in August. My mother was in the garden. She didn't come to the gate. She raised one hand in a half wave without turning her head fully, the same gesture she might use to shoo away a fly. Daniel didn't say goodbye. Isabel hugged me quickly and whispered, "I'll miss you." But she was already looking at her phone before I reached the sidewalk. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself this was my beginning, not my ending. I told myself a lot of things in those first months, standing alone in a tiny dorm room with secondhand sheets and a scholarship stipend that barely covered food. I believed maybe half of them. But I worked. God, how I worked. I studied computer engineering. I tutored other students on the weekends for extra money. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch and called it discipline. I graduated with honors. I found an entry-level job at a mid-sized tech company in the city, and I kept working, kept building, kept learning everything I could. Within 4 years, I had been promoted 3 times. Within 7, I was leading a team of 22 engineers. Within 10, I had been headhunted by a firm in New York that offered me a salary I had to read twice to believe was real. I built a life that was quiet and orderly and entirely my own. I had a small apartment with good light and plants that I kept alive and a cat named Biscuit who slept at my feet. I had 2 close friends who knew me completely. I had work that challenged me and evenings that were peaceful. I was not famous. I was not glamorous. But I was at last content. I called home twice a year. Christmas and Mother's Day. The calls were short. My mother would update me on Daniel's latest venture. He had tried, over the years, a car dealership, a restaurant, a lifestyle brand, none of which lasted more than 18 months. She would update me on Isabel's latest boyfriend. She would ask me vague questions about my job, losing interest visibly when I started to answer. The calls ended the same way every time. Well, it's good you're doing okay, Mija. Take care of yourself. Okay. Not well. Not wonderful. Okay. I stopped expecting more. I simply moved forward. Then, 2 Januaries ago, everything changed. My company acquired a smaller startup, and the merger made news in the industry. A reporter wrote a profile of our engineering team, and my name appeared 3 times in the article, once with the phrase, "the quiet architect of the company's most profitable platform." It was not a headline story. It was not front-page news. But someone somewhere saw it. That someone was my Aunt Rosa. She called my mother. My mother called Daniel. And 10 days after that article was published, I received a message from a number I did not recognize. It took me a moment to understand it was my brother. Clara. Long time no talk, Hermanita. I saw some stuff about you online. Sounds like you're killing it. We should catch up. Mom misses you. I stared at that message for a long time. My mother had not called me on my last birthday. She had not responded to the holiday card I sent in December. But now, apparently, she missed me. I did not respond right away. I waited 3 days, partly out of caution, partly because I needed to prepare myself. Then I wrote back. Hi, Daniel.
Good to hear from you.
I'm doing well. What's going on? What was going on, I learned over the following weeks, was this. Daniel's latest business had collapsed with significant debt. Isabel's fiancé had ended their engagement, and she was in a financial panic, having left her job to plan a wedding that was no longer happening. And my mother who had a small house, a small pension, and a large habit of lending money to her children, was struggling. The family needed help. And they had finally, after 32 years, remembered that I existed. They came to New York in March. All 3 of them, my mother, Daniel, and Isabel, appearing at my apartment building on a Saturday morning with rolling suitcases and wide smiles, as though this were a joyful reunion and not what it actually was. I had debated, for weeks, whether to let them come at all. My friend Petra had told me, firmly, not to. They ignored you your whole life, Clara. Don't open that door. But there was something in me, that 9-year-old girl with her candle in the dark, that still wanted, stupidly, impossibly, to be seen by them, to be acknowledged, just once. So I let them come. My mother looked older, smaller than I remembered. She stood in my apartment doorway and looked around slowly, at the clean, modern furniture, at the framed prints on the wall, at the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, and then she looked at me, and something moved across her face that I had never seen there before. Something I can only describe as recalculation. "This is very nice, Clara," she said. Not, "I'm so proud of you." Not, "I'm sorry I underestimated you." Just, "This is very nice." I made them coffee. I sat across from them at my dining table, and I listened. Daniel talked first, smoothly, using words like temporary setback and strategic pivot and just need a bridge loan to get through this quarter. Isabel cried prettily and talked about how hard it had been, how alone she felt, how she'd always admired me for being so independent. My mother said very little, but her eyes moved around my apartment the whole time, adding things up. And then they asked, not directly at first. They circled it like a question they were afraid of. But eventually, Daniel looked at me with those easy, charming eyes and said, "We're family, Clara. We take care of each other. You've always been the strong one. We're just hoping you can help us through this." The strong one. I had never, in 32 years, been called the strong one. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I'm going to need a few days to think about this." They stayed for 4 days. During those 4 days, I watched my family with new eyes. I watched Daniel casually help himself to wine from my refrigerator without asking. I watched Isabel spend 40 minutes in my bathroom and emerge wearing my perfume. I watched my mother pick up objects in my apartment and examine them, turning them over in her hands as though she were assessing inventory. I heard Daniel, on the phone with someone in the kitchen, say with a laugh, "Yeah, turns out little Clara did all right for herself." Little Clara. On the third night, after they had gone to sleep in my guest room and on my couch, I sat at my desk and I did something I should have done long before. I wrote it all down. Not angrily, I was past anger by then. Calmly. Everything I remembered. The birthday cake. The half-wave goodbye. The phone calls that always ended in okay. The 32 years of being the one who didn't have a spark. And then I wrote down what I had built in spite of all of it. The scholarship I earned alone. The promotions. The platform that was now used by 11 million people. The apartment they were sleeping in that I had paid for, that existed because I had worked without a single hand offered to me by the people now asking for my hand. I read it back. And I felt, for the first time in my life, something I can only call peace. On the fourth day, I sat them down. I told them I was not going to give Daniel a loan. I told them I was not going to give Isabel money for rent. I told my mother that I would set up a small automatic monthly transfer to help with her bills, not because they asked, but because she was my mother, and I was not made of stone. But it would be modest. Enough. Not generous. Daniel's face went through several things quickly. Surprise, then calculation, then a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's fair," he said, in a way that meant it was not fair at all, in his opinion. Isabel looked at me and said, "I thought you cared about family, Clara." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said quietly, "I always cared about family, Isabel. That was never the problem." She had nothing to say to that. My mother was silent for a long time. Then she said something I did not expect. She said, "I didn't see you clearly, Clara. I know that. I was wrong." It was not an apology, exactly. It was something smaller than an apology and larger than nothing. I nodded. I didn't cry. I had used all those tears up in rooms she never saw. They left that afternoon. Daniel hugged me at the door with a heartiness that had an edge of performance to it. Isabel kissed my cheek. My mother held both my hands and looked at me, really looked at me for what felt like the first time. "You turned out well," she said. "I know," I said gently. "I did that myself." She flinched, just slightly. Then she nodded. And then she was gone. I stood in my apartment after the door closed, and I listened to the silence. Biscuit walked across the floor and sat down at my feet, looking up at me with the simple, uncomplicated affection of a creature who had never once questioned my worth. I picked him up. I stood by the window. The city moved below me, full of people carrying their own invisible wounds, doing their own quiet work, building their own lives out of whatever they had been left with. I thought about that 9-year-old girl with her candle and her piece of bread. I thought about the wish she made in the dark. She wanted to be seen. It took 32 years. It cost more than it should have. But standing there, in a life I had built entirely with my own hands, I understood something she couldn't have known then. The most important person who needed to see her was her. And she finally did. That was Clara's story. And if it stayed with you, if some part of it felt familiar, you are not alone. There are more stories like this one waiting for you right here on this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, ring that bell so you never miss one, and leave a like if this story meant something to you. I'll see you in the next one.